Hello, my name is Monica Harris, and I'm Executive Director of the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. We are a multidisciplined, nonpartisan organization dedicated to advancing civil rights and liberties for all and promoting a common culture based on fairness and humanity and understanding. And tonight, I'm happy to be joined by Dr. Tabia Lee and Michael Thad Allen in this discussion of the current climate of freedom of expression and freedom of thought in higher education on our campuses today. Dr. Lee is a lifelong educator. She's the founding member of Free Black Thought. She's a senior fellow for Do No Harm Medicine and the director of the Coalition of Empowered Education. She's contributed to the design, implementation, and evaluation of numerous educational and professional development programs. Her commitment to teacher education, pedagogical design is grounded in her experience as a lifelong educator and a national board certified English, civics, and social studies teacher in urban American public middle schools. Dr. Lee prepares K through 12 and higher education faculty to work with diverse communities by focusing on better understanding, ideology and practice, and curricular implications of race, gender, and other ideologies. On March 6th of this year, Dr. Lee lost her job as a faculty director for the Office of Equity, Social Justice, and Multicultural Education at Anza College in Cupertino, California. When Dr. Lee sought to promote a diverse and inclusive academic environment by entertaining a variety of perspectives and opinions, she was accused of perpetuating white supremacy, and she suffered the consequences. With the support of FAIR's network of attorneys, one of whom is joining us tonight, Dr. Lee filed a federal lawsuit against her former employer for violating her free speech and equal protection rights. Michael Thad Allen is Dr. Lee's counsel of record. Michael graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a PhD in history and sociology, and he spent over a decade in academia as a professor of history. Michael is the author of prize-winning book, The Business of Genocide, in addition to other scholarship he's published. While he enjoyed his time teaching, he witnessed some of the inconsistencies and challenges facing students and faculty in higher education. Michael's passion for civil rights and individual freedoms led to a decision to pursue a law degree, and he graduated from Yale Law School in 2010. Michael began his legal career as a clerk for the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court before moving on to work at reputable trial practice firms. At these firms, he honed his litigation skills, but he also gained interest and experience in cases dealing with higher education. In 2018, he founded his own law firm to focus mainly on cases that he is passionate about, representing students and employees in disputes with colleges and universities. In 2021, he merged with Samantha Harris to form their firm, Allen Harris. Michael brings unique experience as a professor, a passion for law, and relationships forged in practice to serve clients with skill, attention, and compassion. Like those of us in FAIR, he is committed to defending civil liberties and advocating for his clients, and he remains incredibly grateful for the trust that each client places in him. It's important to know that Michael is currently handling 4 similar cases right now, and 3 with FAIR support. So, having introduced you all, given our participants an idea of who you are, Michael, why don't we start out by you sort of giving us a sense of what Dr. Lee's case reflects about the broader challenges that heterodox thinkers face today in academia, and why her case is also unique in many ways.
Yeah, so Dr. Lee's case, unfortunately, I wish I could say it was unique in this regard, that the challenges to free speech, to academic freedom on campus, also the problematic race relations that she faced at the Anza College, those are not unique on American universities. And in fact, they seem to be, I wish it weren't so, but they seem to be getting worse, as we've seen with episodes of anti-Semitism that have arisen on campus since the terrorist attacks of October 7th, staged by Hamas, and so forth. What is unique about Dr. Lee's case, I would say there are 2 things. One in particular is that she was appointed a professor of diversity, equity, and inclusion at the Anza College. Professors have protections that ordinary staff members don't share, unfortunately, perhaps. And she is clothed with the protections of the First Amendment at a public institution. Foothill de Anza College is a state institution funded by the taxpayers of California. So that means that Dr. Lee had both the protections of the First Amendment and the protections of Foothill de Anza College's academic freedom policy, which was quite explicit. And another thing that's not unique is that these policies are relatively widely promulgated by universities. They just don't follow them. When someone says something they do not like, they do not hesitate to do exactly what was done to Dr. Lee, which is to first suppress her speech and then fire her eventually. I think another thing, and we have to be honest about this, Lee, especially, I don't think I've ever shrunk from this, but Lee was a Black woman in this position, expressing things that were very unpopular and were associated on her campus with, quote, white supremacy. And so this created two problems for Dr. Lee. She was just told she was not the right kind of Black person. And I find this incredibly condescending and incredibly racist. Let's not pussyfoot around the issue. There were advocacy on campus, which again is distressingly common on American campuses, celebrating what I identify as 19th century racist stereotypes of Black, Hispanic, colonial peoples, of being not capable of objective thought, not capable of the beauty of the written word. They're supposed to be more communal. They are not capable of individualism, and so forth. Many stereotypes that 19th century racists used to justify their subjugation of Black, colonial, Hispanic, you name it, fill in the blank, in Indian peoples in the Indian subcontinent. This was celebrated because only white people were supposed to have those characteristics. The bizarre thing is on the Anza's campus that this was somehow celebrated, that we were supposed to celebrate Black people as being incapable of anything but some sort of picturesque laziness. And Dr. Lee, quite understandably, objected to that. They were the same stereotypes, whether you are pillaring white supremacy or not. They were the same stereotypes. And I like to say all they did was take the plus signs and the minus signs of a racism that was current 100 years ago and switch them around. So all of a sudden we were supposed to celebrate the lack of objectivity, celebrate the inability to do math or what have you. All of which I firmly believe is not true either. Let's just get that out there. And Dr. Lee stood up against that. And the result was, again, that she was fired. First, her speech was suppressed, then she was harassed, and then she was fired.
Dr. Lee, do you want to give us, or maybe this isn't the best time, but I think it would be a good idea for you to give us some idea of what led you here to this place. What were the circumstances under which you were hired? And when did you realize that De Anza was not an environment that supported you mentally, physically, and spiritually?
Yes, and I thank you to legal counsel for kind of giving a summary of the things that have happened. But what led me to De Anza? I've been teaching my whole life. I'm a lifelong educator. This is not just a job for me, it's my vocation. Sometimes I joke around with people that I've been teaching for as long as I was in school, because I was often used as a peer tutor in my early education. But of course, I got formal education and moved from Northern California, which is where I was born and raised, down to Southern California. And I taught in East LA public middle schools for a decade. And it was something I really enjoyed doing. As I was teaching, I was also serving as a professional development innovator in East Los Angeles public middle schools. This was during the time of English only education in the state of California. It was legislated by law. So what that did was that basically destroyed like all of the bilingual, multilingual programs. And there was perceptions among teachers that if you were not proficient in the English language, you couldn't possibly be gifted. And so I had to help break down those misunderstandings. Sometimes people say, how are you involved with diversity? Well, that's one of the main early ways, was helping teachers to understand giftedness as a neurodiversity, and how they could best serve their gifted children's needs, and understand it's not connected to language proficiency. It's a neurodiversity. And so this is just a field that I've always been involved in and worked in. After I got my doctorate, I went outside the US and traveled a bit, and also, did some volunteer teaching in other nations, post-Soviet nations, and came back here to the US after traveling for a couple of years. The job offers weren't beating down my door like I thought they would be after I got my doctorate. But I ended up adjunct teaching for many years in private Catholic universities. And so I did that for some time, still kept applying for, those tenure track type positions, and as well serving as a teacher educator during those times, helping teachers of English speakers of other languages to diversify their teaching. And during the pandemic was when I had my first breakthroughs into the California community college system, and where I had first a faculty instructional designer temporary position, and then of course the Anza position, which was a faculty director for the Office of Equity, Social Justice, and Multicultural Education. And I went through a rigorous process to get that job. I went through multiple panel interviews. I had to do teaching demonstrations. And it was just a very lengthy and rigorous process. I was honest in that process. And they were honest with me about their needs and what they expected me to do. And then, as I got in and started to do the work, you asked me, I think it was Monica, how soon did I realize? Very soon. It was less than 2 weeks in. So I take an inquiry-based approach, and I was basically interviewing and talking to faculty, to staff members, to senior leadership. I wanted to know what were their perceptions about the work around equity, social justice, and multicultural education on the campus. What were their strengths and weaknesses that they identified, so that I could then best serve the community, that I was coming in to work with on this tenure track position. And one of the early conversations was one where I was told that, one of my staff members was one of the finalists for the position. And they told me that they were very heartbroken that I had been selected, that I was an outsider. They don't know why I was selected over them. They were a former student. They'd been there doing the work, and they didn't know who I was or what my commitment to equity was. And they assured me that I would have a rough ride ahead of me. And then less than 2 weeks after that conversation, that individual, delivered. And that's when I was called, some pretty terrible names and things during a meeting, and accused of supporting white supremacy and other things.
Okay. I think, Dr. Lee, one of the most enlightening revelations we've seen post October 7th is not just that DEI excludes members of the oppressor class, which I think we now know are people who are white, but that DEI apparently was never intended to be inclusive of other groups that have historically been disenfranchised, and that I don't think many of us would see as, or any of us would see as, members of the oppressed class, and that would be Jews. Now, I followed your story. I know it very, very well, and one of the things that struck me is that I think very early on you became aware of the, I'd say, pretty patent anti-Semitism on campus. Did this surprise you? I have to say it did surprise me, and maybe I'm being naive, but could you tell us a little bit more about this and what you learned about exactly how narrowly DEI is being interpreted?
Yes, and some of my learnings have been like kind of hindsight is 2020, right? Because I didn't know it going in. These are things I had to learn as they happened and try to understand and unpack as it was happening to me and to the learning community. But some of my early needs assessment conversations, multiple faculty and staff members mentioned that there was a problem with anti-Semitism, not just on our campus, but in the district and in the other schools surrounding in the California Community College system, if you will. And I was surprised by that. And as more than one person mentioned it, because when you're doing a needs assessment conversation, you can't just take one source and say, oh, okay, that's the situation here. I kept saying, okay, I'll put that in my back pocket. I'll come back to it, right? But over and over again, it was mentioned. And so I said, okay, there's something to this. There's a theme emerging. There's a pattern of information that's being presented to me. And then the thing that really crystallized it for me was we had this group called the Equity Action Council on campus. And this is a taxpayer funded group. It is a campus-wide group, and they're supposed to make action around equity on the campus. And during one of those early meetings, we had some community representatives who came, and they said, and they shared the perception that the campus was hostile. Now, remember, this is in 2021. So this is before October 7th. This is a while before all of these other things that have happened now. And they said that the campus was hostile towards Jewish students. They gave several examples. They cited data. They said, things about our student government and resolutions they had made that made, certain members of the community feel like they weren't wanted, like they weren't welcomed. And they asked us some very simple things. One of the things was, you all have a website that says Standing Against Racism. And we see on the website that you have a big Black Lives Matter Global Foundation banner, and you say Standing Against Anti-Black, racism, and then you have a Stop AAPI Hate banner there, talking about that issue. They said, would you please just update the website to put a little just statement, it doesn't have to be much, that says we stand against anti-Semitism, and and it's something that our community doesn't support. And that was one of the asks. There were others too. But when I took that back to my team meeting and I talked to it with my team and my supervising dean, and I said, could we update the website? Could we just, put that up there? The reaction was absolutely not. We're not updating the website. We're not doing any of those things because this is not an issue that we need to address. And I was kind of baffled. I was like, how, could we be saying we're not going to address it when this group of people just, came to us, they gave us data, they cited specific examples, they had evidence, and just updating the website, that's not even, that's a performative act. You could just update it and then that would be, meeting that concern, that recommendation. And the response was that they would not, they still have not, they refused to do it then, it's still the same. Even as the district itself made a resolution saying we stand against anti-Semitism. They didn't define it. They didn't do anything meaningful. They just said, we as a district stand against it. They didn't even want to do anything to support that from the Board of Trustees. So it was early on, just a rejection of the truths that people came to us with, the concerns that people came to us with. I was even told in some of the meetings and talking about this, how I said, I'm a person of action. What are we going to do? And they said, they, meaning my staff and my dean, said, we're not going to do anything. Those are white oppressors. Jewish people are white oppressors. And we're focused on decentering whiteness. And that's just something I had never encountered such a viewpoint. When I countered that by saying, but the Jewish diaspora is very diverse. How are you saying they're white people or white oppressors? How does that even work? I wasn't even, I was just trying to bring a little bit of reason, countering into the conversation. And I was met with flatness. I was met with no response. When I went ahead and did some community education, because it was clear not only did the campus need it, but my staff and my supervisors needed it as well. I went ahead without budgetary support. I had a multi-week summit on anti-Semitism. I had no budget. I wasn't allowed to ever see my budget, even though I was a faculty director of an office. I never knew what it was. I never knew how taxpayer dollars were being spent, not because I didn't want to, it was just withheld from me. And those events weren't promoted to students in the same way that 2 weeks after or a week after our summit ended, one of the groups on campus brought in speakers who had titles like anti-Israel activist, anti-Zionist, this or that. That was promoted to students when they would log into their Canvas, their online platform. This is all during the pandemic, so we're all remote. That was put up as an announcement so that the students would see that, but they saw nothing about the summit. And so there was this differential treatment, if you will, and promotion of certain ideas and ideologies. And this was happening, as I mentioned, long before, the recent events that have brought this to the awareness of everyone. And it's something that's indicative of the campus climate and the ideologies that are at work. I don't know if the problem so much is DEI as it is the ideologies that are being used in certain DEI programs. And I would say that it would be what I call a critical social justice ideology in operation throughout our California community college system, unfortunately, and in too many other spaces.
Mike, you referenced that Lee's case is not unique in many regards, but wondering when you hear her experience and what she's describing in terms of there's restriction of diversity, perspective of diversity, and the rampant anti-Semitism, do you see a lot of cases like this? Is her case commonplace in that regard, or is it
sorry, go ahead.
Or is it unique in that regard? I'm really
no, unfortunately, it's not unique. It's not unique. And what she has identified is unfortunately widespread in red states, in blue states, throughout the body of academic institutions. Not only that, it's not only restricted to things like hot button issues in DEI, which I think of especially things like I would count the Black Lives Matter movement, things of that nature are very hot button issues within DEI. There are other hot button issues, and they keep changing. They are ever evolving issues of sometimes issues that I don't think if you turn back the clock 10 years ago, it would baffle people that they have even become controversial. What we call people with pronouns, whether you add special words of the alphabet to labels, for the LGBT community, whether you use acronyms, the proliferation of bureaucratic acronyms in favor of plain language is another thing that becomes a hot button issue. I hate to say it. So people of color are BIPOC, and I'm waiting for them to begin adding letters to that as well. I already mentioned pronouns. Just mentioning, and this happened to Dr. Lee as well, just mentioning support for academic freedom is sometimes considered an issue that, quote, triggers people, unfortunately. Other hot button issues lately has been, unfortunately, the prevalence of support for terrorist organizations such as Hamas on campus. That's a new one on campus. And I just hate to say it, but there is a proliferation of reports to offices such as the Student Affairs Office, and they go by many names. Also, obviously, Title IX issues, another hot button issue on campus, Me Too movement, things of that nature. But there's been a proliferation of complaints that students will come forward and claim something has made them feel uncomfortable, which, I don't know how true learning should be uncomfortable experience in some context. But this complaint that something has made someone uncomfortable is now actionable on campus. And they're often operating with definitions that don't apply anywhere else in our society. And so Lee's experience as a faculty member responsible for DEI at Foothill de Anza Community College is by no means unique. And I would just say the problem is much broader, and it is sometimes hard to pull the common thread together. But I would say one of the common threads is that there is a cowardice and fear vis-a-vis the students and administrators on campus, um, who will validate even the most diaphanous subjective feelings of people who are complaining about what is said and done on campus, as long as it's something that they like. Let me put it that way. Dr. Lee already highlighted some selective, as a legal theory would be called selective enforcement of some of these principles. I wouldn't even call them principles because they're often incapable of articulating first principles. But they will selectively enforce things. They'll say they are for diversity, but they don't mean the diversity of viewpoints. They certainly don't mean a diversity that includes Jewish students. And as the decision Students for Fair Admission shows, they certainly didn't mean diversity that included Asian students either. Things of that nature. They only want, if pushed, they'll only talk about people that they like. And as Dr. Lee shows, they don't even mean all Black people. They mean Black people who say things that they agree with. Right. And it's very difficult to pin them down. And as Dr. Lee had experience at the Anza College, if you try to question and you have debates about these issues, they'll also withdraw from those debates and claim that that is also making them feel uncomfortable. Dr. Lee was accused in her tenure review of saying things that made people uncomfortable, of having controversial viewpoints. Remember, this is a state institution of higher learning. You're supposed to have controversial viewpoints. And it's odd because many of these people think of themselves as quasi-revolutionaries, and yet they're afraid of controversial viewpoints, apparently. I don't know if that answered your question, but my answer to your question is yes, it's very widespread.
Okay. Lee, you've been an educator most, if not all, your professional life. And I'm wondering if you can pinpoint for us, some of our viewers are asking this, and I was thinking the same thing. If you can pinpoint when the current landscape of ideological repression began to form. I mean, we get the sense that these developments aren't new. Okay, it didn't happen overnight. But how long has higher education been moving in this direction, seemingly without our knowledge? I'm maybe dating myself, but I graduated from law school in 1991, went to Harvard. And I didn't get a sense back then that this was happening on campus. So as you look back, as you look at the bigger picture, when do you think it began?
So some people call this the long march through the institutions. It's been quite some time. Even though many people weren't aware of it, you can take a look at teacher education training programs and see how they shifted starting in the 80s, late 80s, and maybe even before in terms of advocacy. So thinking in terms of the groups that have really pushed this through the educational systems, and now it's gone mainstream, so it's not just education anymore. It's in houses of worship, it's in civic organizations and so forth. But this started with political extremists like the Weather Underground and others, who after, they did all of their actions in the streets of America, and some of them got locked down into jails and prisons and so forth, they moved their locus of focus into the education system, and many of them became professors. They became professors in teacher education programs in the Bay Area, in the areas that surround De Anza and so forth. And for a long time, the ideas that are now that we all talk about, they were fringe disciplines on campuses. They were part of the ethnic studies programs, the gender studies programs. They were kind of off, to the side, not something you need to take to graduate or anything like that. They were known radicals on campus, right? In those departments, ethnic studies and gender studies. What we've seen is all of those studies programs have now infiltrated the structures and systems of universities and colleges. Not only that, many of the people, so these are trained political organizers, right, who are the impetus for many of these things. They became high-level political organizers in academic senates, in educational leadership, in lobbying for legislation. So we've even seen some of our laws changed as a result of this, and definitions of things changed. And they just quietly and consistently worked, towards these aims of advancing this ideology that I call a critical social justice ideology, little by little, piece by piece. And now we're seeing the fruits of their labor. And we're seeing it on a mass scale. Some people used to say this isn't affecting everybody. These are just this is just a weird California thing, but it's definitely not.
I'd just like to add to what Dr. Lee just said, because you see it manifest itself in ways that I don't think people would expect, nor does it seem connected. So we have like Professor Maitland Jones, a professor of organic chemistry at NYU, disciplined for grading too hard. But that's by no means unique. There was just recently a report of another professor from a historically Black college, a man named, I believe his name is Kendrick Morales, professor of economics. Again, discipline for grading too hard. But it has the same root, because one of the if you pull diversity, equity, and inclusion apart, equity to them doesn't mean what I think people often consider it to mean. They have wrapped this in a sort of blanket of smiley faces, and are constantly using euphemisms to describe what they're actually doing. They might as well name everything apple pie and mom, because it's impossible to say, I don't want equity, I really want unfairness. It's impossible to say, I don't want diversity, I really want, uniformity. I don't want inclusion, I want exclusion. No one says that, no one will argue that for obvious reasons. But when you begin unpacking it, you realize that they're actually arguing that they don't want diversity of outcomes. They want uniformity of outcomes. They count grades as really an oppressive system, because it leads to the differentiation of outcomes. They count equality in terms of whether people are all getting the same grades or not. So of course, professors who grade hard so that students can actually distinguish themselves by their abilities, those professors are attacked on campus, and not only at one campus, at many campuses. They have been. We have another active lawsuit that is backed by FAIR at the University of Penn State Abington, which has some of those issues in it as well. So I just wanted to add to that, Dr. Lee. I'm sorry if I interrupted.
And I just want to extend that, because what we're really talking about is what I've identified now as two different approaches to social justice, a critical social justice approach versus a classical social justice approach. And under the critical social justice ideology, that's where you hear terms like BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. That's where we need the white, Black binary to constantly be at play and at work. That's where you start talking about people in terms of victims and oppressors. And that's where you start to rewrite history so that certain groups, that were once classified as white, now they're not white, now they're BIPOC. We need this group to be this way so that the matrix of dominatrix and power, domination rather, and power still works. Yeah, sometimes it's like that. But and when we're talking about what's being sought for society, under a critical social justice framework, it's that they're looking to advance equality of outcomes in every meaning of the word: educationally, financially, socially, power, politically, in every meaning of the word. And a classical approach, what is being sought is equality of opportunity. And the interesting thing, how I discovered that when I was doing my workshops, trying to have the community come together and define what they meant by equity, because no one had ever done that. And many of the needs assessment conversations, I was told, we're all meaning different things when we say these words, and that's why we can't get on the same page. So when I did those workshops to bring people together and talk about it, I titled one of the workshops Equity and Equality. And I was told by my tenure review committee that even the title was wrong. It was wrong to even title it that way. I was told that equality is a thing of the past. We're not focused on it. We're focused on equity. And then I would ask them, well, then tell me, what is equity to you? and they could never define it for me. They would show me pictures of baseball games and people standing on boxes. They would show me pictures of apples falling from trees and saying equity means everybody gets some of the apples. And I would say, how does that apply to an educational institution or to the work I'm doing with faculty? That could never be explained to me. So these are the kinds of things that are really important to understand the environments that is produced. When you're working from a critical social justice perspective, and the neo-reconstructionist one in particular, that's where they're trying to reconstruct race. That's where they try to tell us that race and racism are present in every interaction, that there's this thing called systemic racism that we should all be working against. And which isn't, theoretically or, supported by any research of any type. It's just something some sociologists and others have come up with, an idea of understanding and explaining the world. And so I think it's important for people to start understanding that. And some of the workshops that I did for students around race ideologies and helping them understand and unpack the different ideologies that teachers may be using that may be in instruction or curriculum, the students were very thankful for those because they came to see that different ideologies of race were being pushed and promoted, and others they had never heard of before. They were never taught about them. They've only seen the work in the outcomes of a critical social justice framing in the eyes of Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo. They had never heard of other race scholars and that there were different ways to view and understand race, like the work of Dr. Sheena Mason, for example, and others. So this is something that's critical for people to start getting the language and understanding it. I was told that I was leading people to danger. That what I was doing was wrong, and that was not welcome there. I shouldn't be doing such things. But really, my commitment as an educator is for critical thinking and to get people thinking about and being able to name what's around them, because you can't, if it has no name, these activists have really been careful about shifting names and words and definitions in the background. What I've done is really brought that to light and to exposed it to the light so that people can understand, what's taking place around them, how the definition of racism has been changed under the critical social justice framework, how the definition of equity has been changed under this. Everything is being inverted and subverted, and it's by design. It's very intentional.
So Mike,
yes.
Given how prevalent this problem is and how long it's been going on and how deeply rooted it appears to be, let's talk about how all of us, what we can do to support those who are fighting back, like Dr. Lee, and those of you who are helping her fight back. What is a recourse? What are the grounds for her case? And there's a multi-part question. And what can groups like organizations like FAIR, who support this litigation, what can we do to hold higher education institutions to account?
Right, and I think what's so unique about FAIR is it has several components to it. But let me answer your first question first. You asked about the legal tools we have available to us. United States civil rights law, which really was an unfinished project in the 1960s, right after the first Reconstruction, after the Civil War left this work undone, is actually very simple and straightforward. It's based on civil rights. It's not based on people's identity. It's not based on precious concept, and it's usually not based on anything resembling very pretty words that cloak what they're actually doing. It means that you have to treat people equally, that every one of us is equal before the law. There can be no discrimination against individuals in employment. That's Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Among recipients of federal funding, that's Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, both of which apply to the Anza College. And it's really quite simple, that civil rights must apply to everyone, right? That we are striving for equality. I don't think anyone of fair mind argues that these fundamental principles have not been fully realized in American life. Actually, that's why we have the laws, and that's why we use them to try to make our society a better place. But those are the tools we have available to us, but I don't see how rolling the clock backwards to some position where you're somehow celebrating racial stereotypes of the 19th century as somehow uniquely virtuous and anti-racist. I don't see how that, which is fundamentally at odds with our civil rights tradition, the civil rights tradition for which Martin Luther King fought and quite frankly died, I don't see how that advances the ball. All right. But really, it's quite simple. We don't need to define what wokeness means, what the Me Too movement means, things of that nature, when we have these tools which are actually quite straightforward, that require equality before the law, that require that people be treated equally in employment, that strive for equality of opportunity. And of course, we all recognize that the United States has not always realized those fundamental principles, but those are the fundamental principles that are at the foundation of our law. Now, the other tool, of course, is our right to free speech under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution and similar bills of rights that are built into our states' constitutions, including the California State Constitution and so forth. That is also a very simple principle, right? There are some exceptions. You can't, for instance, you're not protected your speech in furtherance of a conspiracy, your speech in furtherance of true threats. I can't threaten to come to Dr. Lee's house and kill her, for instance. That is not protected if it's a true threat. But those exceptions are relatively few and far between and easily understood. The fact is, we need the ability to express our opinions in political life on matters of public concern, and that shall not be infringed, especially not by the state, by a state institution that functions at the will of the taxpayers, like Foothill de Anza College. Academic freedom is actually quite a simple principle as well. There is a lot of gatekeeping at institutions of higher education, such as Dr. Lee described. Once you get into your faculty position, however, you should be clothed in the freedom to teach the subject matter of which you are an expert as you see fit. And the antidote to stupid ideas, bad ideas, dangerous ideas in the academy has always been more ideas, more speech, not club someone over the head and fire them, because there's no guarantee that the people doing the clubbing aren't the oppressors, which does seem to be the case in this particular instance.
So this is a question probably for both of you. Equity replacing equality, returning to racial stereotypes from 100 years ago, redefining white supremacy. And Dr. Lee, you've explained how these practices have sort of been slowly developing for years, but that still leaves us with the question, why is this happening? Why do you think it's happening? Do you have a theory?
I don't have a theory, but there are some scholars that do. If you check out the work of Yasha Monk, he has written a book called The Identity Trap. He calls it the identity synthesis theory. And he really does a thorough tracing of how he believes this came to be and why. And I think that's important to understand. That's what my work seeks to do, is to help people to understand the language that's being used, to think critically about the concepts and the tools that are in use. One of the big things that I would call people to is to start looking at the curricula of at their colleges, in their K through 12 systems. And elsewhere, because the things that we're seeing in our streets, when you turn on your news today, it is directly connected to the education that the students have been engaged in from K through 12 on up through higher education. And these ideologies, the critical social justice ideologies, have really spread rapidly. Yasha Monk credits the internet, the pandemic, the lockdown situation, people being hostage to their computers, during that time, and big tech and their pushing of these identity box and categories for race and gender for people as ways to identify and understand themselves and each other. In the state of California, the legislative bodies are trying to make it a requirement for students to take an ethnic studies class to graduate. And I'm really thankful for FAIR and the FAIR Fellows for the work that they're doing, not just in California, but throughout the nation to raise awareness about these ethnic studies programs, and if they're legal or not, if they go with the original color of the law or not, if they're sound for students, because we need to look at that. These protesters and ralliers are not coming out of the blue. They're receiving extra credit oftentimes to go out in the streets and participate. Some are being paid. And what they learn in school in these programs is crucial. And so I see some things, from folks asking, like, how come certain groups are excluded in this DEI? How come this group isn't included or that group isn't included? It really is because of the worldview that's being advanced under this. No one names it, but I'm naming it critical social justice ideology. It says that certain groups of people will always be oppressors and other groups will be victims. And who decides that? Are these sociologists and other ethnic studies program professors and gender studies folks. And we need to get a handle on that, and there needs to be alternatives. This is a very anti-American perspective. It's very much against viewpoint diversity. It doesn't allow questioning or critical thinking. And when you try to engage people in those processes around it, you end up with professors like myself and others who are suppressed and terminated for just asking people, or guiding people even through thinking critically about the topics. And, that's something for people to really understand and take a look into. That's part of my work now with the Coalition for Empowered Education, where I'm designing an alternative to the liberated ethnic studies model. See that word liberated? When you hear it, you think, oh, this is about freeing of people and celebration of freedom. That's not what's in the curricula. It pretends that there's only 4 ethnicities that are worth studying and that have contributed to America. It's exclusionary. It's anti-white. And it's all of the bad and terrible and toxic things that we've mentioned here in this webinar are included in that curriculum, which students in California will be required to take a course in before graduating. So they'll be steeped in an ideology, if you will. And even our UC system is trying to make that a reality. It's not just California, though. This is happening in other states throughout the nation. And these activists are seizing the moment to, under this banner of racial reckoning, to advance all of these crazy ideologies and classes and courses. And if people don't start standing up and resisting against it, if professors, who have stood there on the sidelines and said, oh, I disagree or something feels wrong about this, if they keep being quiet and not saying anything, I fear for all of us.
Mike, where does Lee's case stand now procedurally? I mean, you filed a complaint.
Sure.
Can you tell us
I
what
wish
happened?
yes. So as you all know, the wheels of justice move terribly slowly, but we filed our complaint. The state of California and their attorneys filed a motion to dismiss. The motion to dismiss is at the very beginning of any case that asks the court to throw the case out of court because nothing pleaded in the complaint really rises to the level of an actionable claim, even if you count everything in the complaint as true. So the standard is very favorable to us, but nevertheless, it takes quite a bit of time. That is completely briefed and before the judge, a very young judge, and we're awaiting a decision at that time. We're confident that we will prevail at this stage, and that would mean we would go to discovery, and that's when we'd be able to ask for documents. We would be able to depose witnesses. Unfortunately, that next phase is a very expensive phase of the case because it's very time consuming in both costs because you pay for court reporters, things of that nature. And it's also the longest phase of the case. So we're still awaiting that decision. We will have a status conference coming up in February, I believe. And we'll be able to report more then. I'm hoping maybe by that time we'll get a decision from the judge, but I can't speak for the young judge. I'm sure he is a very hardworking judge, recently appointed to the bench during the Biden administration, I believe. So we'll await his decision.
Can I just say something, Monica, there too?
Absolutely.
Many people may not know this, but FAIR, Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, has been with me since the beginning of this journey. When the group of people went to the Board of Trustees, my first year of being employed, and they did a 5-minute, call for my termination, FAIR was there with me. They wrote a follow-up letter to the Board of Trustees. They talked about, how inappropriate that was and how that called things into question. When the Tenure Review Committee member told me 2 weeks before the decision was made that there would be a unanimous decision and I would not be recommended to continue, I went to FAIR. I filed an incident report and FAIR was there for me. FAIR has been with me from the beginning of this. During my whole year where I was isolated, shunned, censored for my second year of employment there at Anza, FAIR was with me there too. So FAIR has been with me since the beginning of this journey. The legal advocacy team has just been amazing. And that's why I encourage people, if something is happening on your campus and it feels wrong or it's happening to you or a colleague, fill out an incident report. Get connected with FAIR if your civil liberties are being violated. They will stand by you. They will be there with you. And I'm urging people to donate to the Legal Advocacy Fund, because that's how I have been able to have legal representation throughout this time. If I didn't have that, I would have just disappeared into the night and no one would have heard of me again. And so I just want to thank you all for everything that you have done and to encourage people to keep donating. It doesn't just go to my fund, it goes to all of the cases that FAIR is funding. And so many people, legal action needs to be taken in many of these cases because there are deeply entrenched practices, and some of these people act like gangsters on their campuses, and like they're not accountable to anyone. And so they need someone to step in and pump the brakes and bring the law back into the center sometimes.
Wow. Thank you.
I would just add that the attorneys who work with FAIR are doing it at steeply reduced rates to make this litigation possible. And we take them because we believe in the cases. They're carefully vetted by FAIR to make an impact in multiple dimensions, publicly and also legally.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. Thank you, Michael. We're so glad you were able to join us tonight. And for all of you who are watching, we're so glad that you were able to join us as well. And we're grateful for your support. It takes a lot of courage to stand up to injustice, as Dr. Lee has done. And thankfully, she's not alone. Every day, more Americans are finding the courage to stand up against values that are clearly un-American. And standing up, as Dr. Lee said, is the only real hope we have. But as you've also heard, litigation is extremely expensive and fighting injustice isn't a quick or cheap process. So anyway, FAIR operates entirely on donations. If you appreciate the work we're doing and how we're helping plaintiffs like Dr. Lee, we invite you to consider making a donation this holiday season. Your gift to our legal advocacy fund allows us to continue doing this important work. And there's a link to our donation page in the chat. Again, we thank you all for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.